Hello everyone, welcome to another PS Book Reviews. Today we're going to talk about this book, Nightfall by Isaac Asimov and Robert Silverberg. I was disappointed. I'm a big Asimov fan. Everything that I read from him before was pretty good. Nightfall is considered one of the best science fiction works from Asimov, and for a few years it was considered the best science fiction short story globally. It was one of the short stories that apparently gave Asimov his name. I hadn't read it before this book, and this novel was pretty much given to Robert Silverberg to rewrite a little bit of the short story and expand upon it. And he ended up creating 3 long chapters for it. The first is a sort of introduction to the storyline where the main story that Asimov originally wrote happens. The second chapter is pretty much that story with a few adaptations. Some things change names. There are names for the stars themselves or the suns that orbit the planet. There's some extra characters also involved. Not that many, just one in particular that I'm thinking of. And some names also change on things, but overall the action is pretty much the same. And then there's a third chapter, which is what happens after the Nightfall and the outcome, the aftermath of the whole thing. So for those who don't know what Nightfall is about, it's a story of what would happen to a civilization in a planet far away, somehow resembling Earth, but not quite Earth. And they have 6 suns, and they never saw night. They never saw complete darkness, because they always have light on them. And when they go to sleep, they go indoors, they take a safety light with them because they're afraid of the dark. They evolved with an irrational fear of the dark because their entire civilization is based on having light all the time. But there is one specific day every 2049 years, I think is the number, where there is an eclipse for a few hours, and that eclipse destroys the whole civilization. And this is the story of some scientists who have discovered that thing is about to happen, and they predict that the whole civilization is going to go mad. And that was the premise behind the whole story, that Asimov felt like, from what I read, they were having a discussion on what would happen if suddenly a civilization would find a starry sky for the first time in ever. And Asimov predicted that they would go mad over that. And the story is written all around that. While other people thought that they would just be amazed at discovering this new thing. So it explores that topic, but the book has a lot of caveats that they start creeping in, and by the end of the second chapter, and you start really sniffing them out. And after I finished reading, I went to read some reviews, and a lot of people agreed with what I was thinking. I ended up reading the original story. The original story is, well, it's shorter than this one, but this book is written accepting that you have already read the original story, so that you will not be surprised. So it doesn't actually build up. The first chapter that is supposed to be building up to the main storyline doesn't really. It does build up, but it gives you certain false expectations. Like it shows you the point of view of these different characters, and because they are prominent characters on what will happen next, but then the action switches to following a specific character after that, which is just weird. And while on the original short story of Asimov, it made some sense that it was based on several different conversations that a few different characters would have, because that's Asimov's style of narrative. On Silverberg's rewrite, it felt forced into it. Even the second chapter felt a bit out of tune, because you're reading it with the assumptions from the first chapter. Reading the first chapter alone was fine. By the end of the first chapter, I was like, okay, this is what's going to happen. And then there's like this gap of time where a lot of things are not explained properly that should have been explained on this first chapter, mainly why the government didn't do anything to prevent this catastrophe from happening that was known like 1 year in advance, with scientific evidence of that. In a civilization where both the religious and science people are aware of this big catastrophe happen, there seemed to be no one that took care of that except for these two small factions of 4 people in a university and the religious nutcases who are already predicting it. How is this possible? It doesn't make any sense. And on Asimov's short story, he kind of hints at why that is with one of the characters, which is like a journalist that supposedly covered the story wrongly and just ridiculed scientists and made him look weak. But in practical terms, there are two things wrong with it. First, on the introduction, that character is completely benign. Not benign. What's the contrary of benign? Means good. Good. Neutral, let's call it that. He was neutral. He was around. He was a journalist. Some people said, oh, it's dangerous to relate with journalists. They will spin you around. But he was always like an accessible person and trustworthy, and that kind of thing, and just questioning things logically and just wanting to know more about things. He never showed that face that he would write horrible, miscued things for the sake of, getting more readers or something. And then suddenly on the second chapter, he's that character. And it makes no sense. It only makes sense because in Asimov, that was the role that he has. So why didn't Silverberg write that more into the introduction? Why didn't he do that follow-up, like scientific community trying to reach into government? And there are a lot of questions left unanswered in that part. That was the main thing that I noticed on those transitions, because he tried to force the original story of Asimov into it, which makes sense, but then he would have to compensate otherwise. Then there's the introduction of a character, which made some sense on the story. I didn't know that. I just realized that she didn't exist when I read the original from Asimov after I have read the novel. She makes some sense for the Silverberg's version. It explains a bit more the whole scientific acceptance of what is to come. It connects better with the religious nutcase. It connects better with the journalist. So it's a character that does make some sense in existing, but it doesn't exist at all in Asimov's version. So it's a character that sort of got made up to glue things a bit together, but didn't quite fit everything, especially in the final chapter. It didn't make much sense the way that the third chapter went. So the third chapter is about the Twilight, what happened after the eclipse happened, and all of the humanity went crazy and started burning down their own cities and lost their minds in a way that is not at all psychologically verified. That should have been a bit better validated with some proper, people with that deal with sort of claustrophobic issues and things like that. Because this was written originally in 1941, and a lot of scientific advances and medical advances happened since then. So Asimov's premise that you would just start excuse me, that you will start feeling these claustrophobic anxiety things might make some sense, but they also connect with fear of open spaces and going into buildings and stuff like that, which might not make so much sense in terms of light. But whatever, that part I kind of accepted as, just you have to assume certain things when you're writing science fiction. There were some other specific things that, like, people just went mad, but only some people went mad, and they just blame it on more or less exposure to the stars without really having any medical, logical reasoning behind that. And then there were some hints that smarter people got less affected, without any medical evidence of that whatsoever. And also the characters described on the third part feel more like people who went crazy and just acting like zombie. It felt a lot like a zombie apocalypse wannabe sort of thing. All the characters you run into are just doing things that are crazy for the sake of doing crazy things, and they are in groups because they are in groups, which doesn't make any sense because they're supposed to be killing each other. The whole description of the decaying part of the destroyed society isn't very brought through. You see the characters walking back and forth a lot, but like there's no heavy description of the bodies and the destruction and all that kind of stuff. It's slightly mentioned, but it's mostly washed away, and the narrative ends up being where they were walking towards and not the immense amount of bodies on the field and dealing with all the having to survive thing. That's a bit of left in the open, which in my opinion should have been focused more to bring more realism into being into that sort of scenario. So that's one of the parts that the final chapter sort of missed. Especially the connection with the crazy people didn't really make any sense. It felt like the only people who were still sane were the original characters, and even some of those didn't really escape. It just didn't make any sense medically, scientifically speaking. Whilst reading Asimov's short story, original short story, it's left to the imagination what will happen. So you don't really know to what depths some people will go more crazy or not. And then it's just assumed by Silverberg that they just go crazy, unable to recover their sanity. And that's not how psychological traumas work. Some work like that, but I just felt it could use more proper, it's not discussion, it's research, proper research with some actual medical staff to try to figure out a better compromise to describe the whole thing. It felt like the whole thing felt a bit rushed. It didn't feel like it was edited, revised properly. From what I read on comments Asimov received and the final work, he said it was pretty much what I wanted to write. Works, ship it, had little changes to request, is what is quoted around on Wikipedia and stuff. For me, it feels like it missed a proper editor reading it from beginning to end without knowing the original Asimov story and, going, okay, this doesn't make sense to make it into a proper story. The ending was also very weird. Some characters changed completely, like their dynamics. Shearing is very weird between the Asimov version and the first chapter version and the third chapter version. Even the religious fanatic is also very weird. On Asimov's version, on the middle part, he seems like a complete lunatic without accepting any sort of logic or order. And then on the third, there's different ways that he is perceived or comes across. I don't know. I didn't like it. To me, it feels like a cash cow, and I want to get rid of this book. I don't want to keep it on my bookshelf, so I'm gonna try to sell it to someone. One of the few Asimov books that I rather not have. I do want to have the short story, but I guess I can find it on some compilation of the best science fiction stories somewhere out there. I think it's already past like the date of being in public domain. So actually, I think it's already like you could find a PDF available and probably people can publish it already, but I'm not sure. So yeah, have to check on that. But anyways, not happy with the novella. I gave it 2 stars out of 5 on Goodreads. And yeah, if you have already read it and disagree with my opinion, feel free to say so on the comments below. Would gladly hear your arguments, why you think it's well written, and glad you enjoyed it. I didn't manage to enjoy it that much. It was an interesting world, but it felt like the original Asimov story was a lot more to the point, and this additional things ended up not gluing together well with the original Asimov story. Still an interesting concept of how the society would evolve from that. It makes you reflect on the role of religion, the role of science on predicting these things, on how the world would respond to those. I don't completely agree with what happens. I don't want to spoil the ending, but yeah. I don't know. I just like Asimov's shorter version better. Anyways, that's all I have to say. Sorry for the long rambling. Had a strong opinion on this particular book. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you do like this video and would like me to do more like this, you can support me through patreon.com/psenough. You can also suggest other stuff for me to read, either classics or more recent stuff. As long as it's not that heavy, I would gladly take a look. And yeah, that's it for me. See you next video. Bye bye, everyone. Take care.